Why three? And then what's the relationship between them?
I think what some authors or researchers and writers and others have done a really fantastic job of is that sense of personal purpose. Who am I? What do I stand for? And what I like to cheekily say as part of your personal purpose, how do I want to be known when I leave a room? But what it dawned on me, Danny, was that if the individual who wakes up in the morning and is Dan or Danny or Chris as a sense of personal purpose has to go to work and doesn't recognize that there's actually two other types of purpose that they're getting in the car or the subway and going into work for, then they're in deep trouble. Because if they're not aware that they should be feeling a sense of purpose in their role at work, does their work give them a sense of meaning and value? Do they feel valued by their team, by their organization, by their boss? So role purpose, as I call it, also has a nice to employee engagement. Do you feel engaged in what you do? But then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, and that is the organization. If the organization's purpose is one in which it's only focused and fixated on profit or harming the environment or not caring about giving to the community, if that runs like nails on a chalkboard to you, do you think you're going to kind of be in a sweet spot, Danny? Do you think that it's all going to connect? Now, we have decisions to make, just like Tim Bray did.
So whose responsibility is it for alignment of those three things, if those three things are sort of necessary in order to give somebody a sense of purpose?
What a great question. It's actually twofold. So again, I believe, and I've seen this, where there's a principled stance that the organization has to take to ensure that their employees, their team members, feel and can actualize purpose in the role. And because it's an ecosystem, because we're all in this together, I do truly believe that organization also must extend its hand to help the team member with their own sense of personal purpose. But then flip it around, whether it's Tim Bray or otherwise, we must always be curating, developing, questioning who we are in our own life, i.e. personal purpose. But we also have to recognize that there's a development path in our career, and we're going to have to learn that role purpose is actually a journey as well. It's not instantaneous. But again, if we think that there's things in our role over time, let's say, that are really contradictory to our sense of purpose as self or the organizations, then we got to do something about it. Maybe it's the wrong role. Maybe it's the wrong organization, Danny. So there's two. The organization has a responsibility, I believe, whether you're CEOs, C-suite, CHROs, CLOs, but also you coming into the organization, you've got some muscle building to do as well.
Do you think that's a relatively new construct, this idea of organizations having some responsibility in helping people find their purpose? Or do you think that's always existed?
There are some great examples out there. Danone yogurt, those folks back in, I think it was 1970, 1968, somewhere around there. There's an example of an organization that said right from the get-go, this is how we're going to operate. This is our raison d'etre, if you will. They call it responsible capitalism. And they said from there that they would support community. They'd support their employees. They would support the environment. This is like 1970 when, Uncle Milt Friedman put out his famous New Yorker report or article or essay that said shareholder capitalism, shareholder primacy is how we should be operating our organizations. And Reaganomics and Thatcheromics took hold. And, that's what we've been stuck in ever since.
What advice would you give to talent leaders and CLOs in terms of how they approach this topic of purpose?
I'd say, first and foremost, make sure that you've developed it, declared it, defined it, and you communicated it so that you can point to it and its examples. So whether it's videos or stories, that's kind of important, first and foremost. Secondly, on the attraction point itself, if you're not having a conversation, let's say, in the interview stage or in the, submission stage about A, what is our purpose, but B, how do you see our purpose meshing with yours. Because we want to be hiring the right type of people who are going to enact and continue on, the sense of hopefully operating with a higher sense of meaning. I think that's really important to have it up front, out in the open, and in the conversations of, the interview stage even. And then when you're a CLO or CHRO and you're in the organization, again, back to that earlier point when Danny and I were chatting about, the two types of responsibility, that organization, I do believe, has a fiduciary responsibility to inculcate purpose into the pedagogy and curricula of the organization. So whether that's in the onboarding piece, for example, right, just sort of getting your feet wet, if you will, but then having either purpose workshops that are ones about, your own personal sense of purpose, having leaders in a webcast series, it's Purpose Month in February. So we're going to chat with 5 or 10 VPs, et cetera, about what it is that their sense of purpose, personal purpose is, not even thinking about whatever your company name is, just them as people. When we're weaving it into our curriculum and pedagogy, our career pathing, it actually becomes systemic.
There is maybe a danger to all this, and that is, I know Danny feels strongly about sort of like monocultures in organizations, and you end up with a lack of diversity if you're just hiring people for a sort of culture fit. Do you think that's a possible downside of this?
I do believe that you can use purpose and your culture and your values to make good decisions and better decisions that revolve around your ethos, your way of being. But I wouldn't hire folks as sort of a groupthink hire. Oh, we better all think the same way. Then we end up with a very, staid, placid, not very differentiating type of organization.
Perhaps we can talk a little bit, Dan, about the dreaded COVID 2020. How has it changed how you think about purpose? And secondly, what do you think is the job to be done next as we start to hopefully put work back together?
I don't think purpose and this, operating with a sense of higher meaning is as foreign a concept as it was back in 2015, 2016. I think we're actually inching our way to it being part of the vernacular and lexicon of how we operate. And we can thank several organizations. Satya Nadella, as he came on as CEO at Microsoft, clearly waxed lyrical 5 years ago-ish when he came on about how we need to operate not just for a sense of EBITDA, but for others. I think Paul Pullman, the great example of Unilever, starting in 2010, and continued now with Jope, its CEO as well. And then the work of Larry Fink at BlackRock in his annual January letter in January of 2019. He said, look, if we're not operating with a sense of purpose, why are we here? And then followed it up with the January letter of 2020 with, we better all become environmentalists. And so when you're trading $7 trillion, Chris, as they are in kind of the world's largest shadow bank, Fink is helping us see the light, if you will. There are some examples, and there's some shining stars that are starting to shine a little brighter. Now the pandemic hits, and what I'm noticing is a couple things. First of all, there are still a bunch of morons out there that think they can hierarchically pound their way into increasing or at least sustaining their revenues or their profit levels by not caring, either for their people or with a sense of purpose and community. Just so asinine. Whether it's an Amazon example or otherwise, there are a ton that I've been observing. I mean, a ton. I've kept track of them on a spreadsheet because I keep coming into them. But that said, as horrible as this pandemic has been, somewhat obviously, it's a tragedy. It's a human tragedy. It has also, I think, awakened many C-suites from where they were to where they ought to go. And let us not, discount the civil unrest from Breonna to George Floyd, et cetera, right? There is a palpable, I believe, pent-up global frustration with how many organizations had been operating. And so, what it comes down to, I certainly truly believe, Chris and Danny, is empathy. There is such a relationship between empathy and purpose that our organizational leaders that are CLOs and CHROs need to start teaching about empathy and its relationship to purpose. And empathy, very quickly, to me, there's three types that I've observed. And I call it head, heart, and hands. The head empathy, if you will, which is known as psychologists call it cognitive empathy, is how we intellectualize how someone else is thinking about something. So you think about how they're thinking, i.e. use your head to get inside their head. What's known as emotional empathy is the feelings part. How is someone feeling about a particular situation? And then the last one is known as sympathetic empathy, and that's what I call the hands. Are you willing to do something about it because you now understood how they're thinking and feeling? So back to purpose. If we're teaching as CLOs and CHROs in the organization about purpose, purpose of self, purpose of role, purpose of org, I think we need to also fill the gap of empathy by teaching the relationship of purpose to empathy, and how when we think and feel and do, we can then understand that we're not in this, i.e. life, just for ourselves or just for our own organizational needs. We empathize of how others are thinking in the community, about the environment, how our employees are thinking about how we're treating the environment or the community, if we're turning a blind eye, not doing enough to serve those in need. I think that relationship is going to be key for CLOs going forward.
What do you think are the main things that we got to get done as we sort of move into hopefully the next phase and we sort of put work back together again? And how can purpose help us think about that?
I can't stand, to be honest, you two, the notion of the new normal. I've been yapping away, calling it the Great Reset. So we had the Great Recession, we've had the Great Depression. I think this is such a wonderful opportunity for us to inculcate a great reset. How are we defining ourselves in our work? And use this time, to come back to the reset of how work ought to occur when we'll be in, I hope, hybrid models. I hope in, achieving a different way of operating our business, our organizations. So if we can reset a few things in this time that we got till the vaccine comes, and look at our behaviors, look at our way in which that we might be developing or not developing our people in the organization with purpose. Look at how we're hiring or not hiring people with a sense of purpose. Look at how our organization has or doesn't have a declaration of purpose, a purpose statement that says this is what we stand for and how we operate in our community and in the world. There's all kinds of chances as people are planning for 2021 right now, as we know in the time of this recording in mid-October. It's a chance to reset so that when we do have the vaccine, it's never going to go back to the old normal, because that assumes it actually was normal.
One question that we always ask our guests, particularly for this podcast, because we think it's fairly poignant, is about your own personal purpose, especially as you went over your career. Would love to ask you, why did you choose the line of work that you chose? How did you end up where you are? And who inspired you to do the work you do?
When SAP, the company that I did work for, the reason I ended up working for SAP was because it acquired the company I was CLO for, which was a company called Business Objects, based in Paris, but locations around the world, had about 10,000 employees, just under $1 billion in revenue, and it was a business intelligence software company at the time of my life. SAP came in 2007 and acquired the company. And for about a year, I tried in earnest to sell them, SAP that is, in Germany, on what our culture was. I mean, the business objects culture was one of family, just to put it bluntly. And we were already, back in that day, we had a community investment team, and there was about 10 people. And you talk about philanthropy. I think this company, Business Objects, defined what it meant to be a philanthropic, kind of purpose-driven company. Anywho, during the time in which SAP acquired us, and I was making way too many trips to Frankfurt to convince them of our culture, I also, living in Vancouver, started climbing something known as Grouse Mountain, which is in North Van. It's just 1.8 kilometer up hike. And I was doing that like 2 or 3 times a week. And I got it down to about 42 minutes straight up. But I kept swirling around these words, like, what's struggling with me? Why can't this fit? Why is SAP feeling like this? It just nails on a chalkboard. It's just not cool. So after, I don't know, a bunch of times, I say, you know what, I called it a mission statement at the time, Danny. I need my personal mission statement. Like something's wrong here. And so I ended up landing on